So I'm going to start here with a blank page. I have these strange images on here. I'm going to actually start by doing a layer of collage down on the bottom, and then we're going to be building that up. So materials that I'm going to be using for right now, I'm going to be using just some Mod Podge. You can do matte or shiny. I like to do matte. I might be using a paintbrush for right now. I definitely like to use these foam brushes when I'm using Mod Podge, because then if they get wrecked, I'm not ruining a nice paintbrush. I have a container with some Mod Podge poured inside of it, and I have some scrap pieces of paper that I'm going to be collaging with. Now, I have a piece of paper with some music notes and an old book. You could easily be doing this with pattern paper or pages with images. It just is up to you how you go about this. So I like to start by ripping up my pages, and I don't like to be too methodical with how I'm going to rip them. I'm going to need enough to cover both of these pages. You could also cut these, up to you. So now that I have my pieces all ripped up, I'm gonna go ahead and start to apply my Mod Podge. So I'm doing this again with my foam brush, and I'm just gonna apply Mod Podge directly down on my paper. Now I'm gonna go with my foam brush, and I'm gonna generously apply some Mod Podge in an area, about 4 inches by 4 inches. I don't like to work too much bigger than this because I'm always afraid that my Mod Podge is going to dry. And then I'm gonna go ahead and add my pieces. And as I add my pieces, I might find I need to add a little more Mod Podge down. You want to keep the Mod Podge fairly thick, and you want to keep it wet as you're doing this. And I'm just going to go ahead and layer my pieces. Now, I really do not like the background here, so I want to be careful to cover everything up. You're going to notice that my pieces are starting to layer together, so anytime they layer together, I'm just going to go underneath with some Mod Podge. And once I have my sections mostly covered up, I've got a couple of spaces to go here. I'm going to just add this piece. You want to make sure you have Mod Podge underneath everything, and then we're going to go through with a layer of Mod Podge and seal it in. So you're going to use quite a bit of Mod Podge. This is why I like to use a sponge when I'm doing this. You can paint it, you can dab it on, whatever works, but this layer is sealing all of your paper in so it stays down on your page. So you might find you might have to lift things and put them back down and get it nice and sealed in. So I'll do a section about that big, and then I'm going to continue to do this to fill up both of my papers. Now, once I have my background down and it's dry, we want to make sure that everything is completely dry in between steps. I'm going to go ahead and add a really thin layer of gesso. I just use this Blick acrylic brand of gesso, and gesso basically is just like primer, so it's going to my pages ready and allow them to take on either paint or ink. I'm just going to go through and give this a really quick layer. I do not want to cover up what I have underneath. I just want to make it a little less noticeable. I would suggest doing this step fast, because if you're like me and if you accidentally get too much on a certain spot, if you get it while it's still wet, you can pick most of it up. I'm not messing around with palettes or anything. I'm just squirting this directly on my brush and going for it. All right, so now this is dry, and I'm going to be building this up with layers using ink and stamp pads. Now at this point, I could sort of make the decision, do I want to collage any more on top of this? I really like to, at this point, sometimes maybe add some layers with tissue paper or continue to build this up, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to leave it like this. So just to recap, I've got my first layer of collage, then I have a layer of gesso that I lightly put over the top. The biggest downfall to working like this is you do have to let layers dry in between. So I just went over with a hair dryer and I dried this off. Now, what I'm going to be using for the next few steps, I have a collection of various stamps. I like to use some larger stamps, and then I like to choose some smaller ones that have some more specific patterns. I have a couple chosen. We'll see what I end up using. So I'm going to start here by giving my background that I've created just some color. So I have these two different ink pads. I think the colors will work together. We'll see how this turns out. You can blot with this. Looks like this one. That's gonna kind of be my only option. If you want, you can put your hand or put a book or something behind, depending on the surface that you're working on. So I'm gonna go through with a couple of different colors here and just give this a ground of color. Now the idea here is I don't want to cover up what I have underneath it. I'm just adding some additional interest by incorporating color. So that one was kind of sticky. We'll see what how this one turns out. I like to mix my colors, so I like to choose 2 or 3 colors that I'm gonna put together. This particular brand, sometimes you're able to kind of rub the ink on. This particular brand seems to be pretty sticky, so it's wanting me to just blot it on, which is fine. You're gonna notice this is not an even application of color, nor is it supposed to. I get some areas that are darker, I get some areas that are lighter. I have selected colors that I know are going to look good together, and I'm gonna keep doing this. I'm gonna try some of the Distress ink now and see how that turns out. See how that goes on a lot darker, a lot more bold. I don't necessarily want every color of ink that I have out all over the place, so I'm gonna be kind of selective with how I put this on. Now, the Distress ink, if you rub it on, is really going to pick up on any wrinkles or ridges or raised areas. So again, I'm kind of using my hand underneath so that the ink is taking on more of the color on the page. Okay, so now that I have my basic wash of color, I'm going to start using some of my more specific stamp pads. So just to point out, I can still see my paper underneath. It's a little masked by the gesso and the color, but that's how we want it. So now I have some decisions to make. This is kind of my go-to stamp, so I think I'm gonna stick with it. I'm gonna choose the archival ink. I could also use this Distress ink, but I'm gonna choose the archival ink. I want this to really stand out. So I'm gonna take this and go ahead and rub it on the ink pad. And now here's where I have to make sure I do have something underneath this so that there we go. So that when I stamp down, there's something to counteract the pressure. So I'm just gonna put this stamp down. I'll hold this nice and tight. There's a bell, class is over. And I'm gonna stamp this down, put some pressure on it. There we go. Again, can you see that completely? No, it's just another way to add an additional layer. We're just adding some visual complexity and we're building up our layer. So layer number 1 was that collage, layer number 2 was the gesso, layer number 3 was my colorful ink, and layer number 4 was my stamp. Now I'm gonna go through with a finishing layer. My 5th layer is going to be more stamping. And this is where I'm gonna go through with my more specific colors or my more specific stamp. I'm gonna be using black for this part. Side note, when you're not using your ink pads, just make sure that you leave the lids on them all the time. I have a darker Distress ink here that I might try. Or archival ink, I should say. I've got kind of my dragonfly stamped on there. I don't know, we'll see what else I decide here. So once I am happy with that, I have my finishing touches, which involves the distress ink. So I like to use the black distress ink. I could use any color I want, but for me, I'm gonna use the black. And I'm going to take this around the edges and distress it. So I'm gonna hold this up and angle my distress ink and just rub it along the edges. Now, depending on the angle, you're gonna get more or less of the ink on here. You could try this with other types of ink as well, but this is kind of what distress ink is known for, is distress. And I just think this frames things in pretty nicely. And there you have it. Kind of a funky distressed background built up using layers of collage, gesso, and stamps. And now I would go over the top of this and add in some collage, maybe some drawing materials, and continue building. But this is a great background or a great base to build off of. I hope this helped.